Hello and welcome back to History 1302. As you should already know from the title slide, today's lecture is the Second Red Scare and Joseph McCarthy. So we're just going to jump right in and get our feet wet. After the onset of the Cold War, which we talked about last time, we didn't finish the Cold War, but we introduced an overview of those first decades of the Cold War. And after the onset of the Cold War, fear of communism, both abroad and in the United States, greatly intensified. Now, a lot of people and a lot of different historians have kind of termed this fear of communism McCarthyism, and this whole kind of time period is this period of McCarthyism. But that's kind of not a great term to use because the Second Red Scare started before McCarthy and it actually lasted longer than McCarthy. And so that's not really it's a bit of a misnomer to link it to just the one man. And I think that'll make more sense as we continue to make our way through this lecture. Um, and so the US was never friendly to communism. There was a very strong sentiment against communism before World War II. After the Russian Revolution, the United States actually sent military backup to Russia to fight against the revolution. They sent troops to intervene in Siberia. They sent about 13,000 troops, so it wasn't even, a super small amount. So you can see that the United States was never overly fond of or liked socialism or communism from the get-go. And so it won't be until 1933 that the United States even officially recognizes the USSR as a legitimate government. That's important because after the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia declares itself a communist country, and the United States, for almost 20 years, refused to acknowledge the USSR as a valid, legitimate country, which is going to cause a lot of animosity between the two. In 1939, the House of Representatives formed something that is known as the House Un-American Activities Committee. That is the HUAC. That's one of your hot button words. The House Un-American Activities Committee. And it is formed as an anti-fascist group, technically, but it very quickly becomes an anti-communist group that will last until 1975. And they will establish many investigations in the United States looking for communists. We'll talk a whole lot about those over the next half hour or so. They would ask people if they were ever a member of the Communist Party, and if someone was to say yes, then that person would find themselves blacklisted. If they refused to answer, they would be found in contempt, and they would go to jail for 1 year's time. They could not claim the Fifth Amendment during this time period, not if it related to communism. There was no Fifth Amendment, and these investigations that the HUAC engaged in, these investigations of people throughout the United States that they participated in and created, they were used to encourage other people to rat other Americans out. Like, they were used to put pressure on Americans to turn anyone in that they felt might be a communist or engaging in communist activity or any sort of traitor-like behavior. So in 1940, you have the Smith Act, which made it a federal crime to belong to the Communist Party of the United States, because they quoted that it was a federal crime because the Communist Party of the United States wanted to overthrow the U.S. government and install a different type of government. So they deemed that to be a member of the Communist Party was a federal crime that would land you 20 years in prison, which is a fairly steep, penalty or punishment. It is mainly used after World War II, though, because Russia was an ally during World War II. Additionally, the Smith Act required all immigrants to register with the federal government just in case they had communist connections. So they also had to register with the United States government. And again, I can't stress enough that Russia is a wartime ally. That was weird. A wartime ally. And so there's all these Russian ally posters. But suddenly, after World War II is over, your ally becomes your enemy, and your enemy kind of becomes your friend. Immediately after the war, you have something called Operation Paperclip. And when you look at that in this new Cold War context, it's really somewhat disturbing and also very interesting. And what the paperclip, Operation Paperclip is a secret program to recruit former Nazi scientists for technology, for technological advancements. And so 1,600 Nazi scientists were secretly and illegally brought into the United States to create technology for the U.S. military. The military and their sources actually created and faked backgrounds for each one of these scientists. And yet, at the same time, the USSR is shunned, and people in the USSR are considered enemies of the United States. So you have Nazis being brought into the United States, paid high dollars, given new identities, and secreted into the United States. And now you have Russians that are deemed the enemy. There is a vast paranoia about the enemy. There's this belief, they called communism the Red Menace. And so there's this really big belief that the Red Menace is real. I mean, this is a real problem. This is something Americans really need to worry about and be concerned about. And so they have this overwhelming fear that communism is going to be, that it's widespread and that it's, everywhere. And so there's this big push for Americans to report any and all suspected communist behavior. Anyone who you suspect might be a secret communist or dealing with communists or anything like that, then you should immediately report so that it can be taken care of. And you can see this in pop culture, of course. You have Captain America. We've already talked about Captain America. But his number one enemy is, of course, is going to become the communist. You have the Red Menace. You have all of these pop cultural things that are going to explode in the United States, and they're all very anti-communist. And it's not even going to end after the Red Scare. In the 80s, every enemy in every movie was still a Russian. If there was a spy, if there was anything happening, it was generally going to be a Russian terrorist who was doing it. And so the crossover into pop culture will happen during this time period, and it will kind of just stay there for a very long time. I would say really until 9/11, and then of course there's a great switch toward Middle Eastern terrorism as opposed to Russian terrorism. But there are all sorts of books. And in your PowerPoint presentation, if you flip through it, you'll see all the pictures of the different book covers and the different ways that the Red Scare really infiltrated pop culture during the time period. So make sure you go have a look at those. And if for some reason you can't access the PowerPoint, or for some crazy reason you're not in my class and you're watching this, you can simply give Red Scare pop culture a Google, and you will be shocked at all the different things that you will see. They also start in advertising. You can see the Red Scare manifest itself in U.S. advertising. There's also articles how to tell if someone is a communist. And so they would even like sell products. So you'd see advertisements were like, do you need to know if your neighbor's a secret communist? If so, buy this product and it will take you through the different steps on determining if someone is a communist. It was quite outrageous. So it's in this context that you see domestic and in this domestic and anti-communist context, you see the right to free speech curtailed. There becomes this great big fear that communism has infiltrated the government as well. Like, what if communism and communists have gotten into our government, gotten into it, and now it's eating it away from the inside. And so in 1947, you have the Federal Employee Loyalty Program. All employees of the federal government must now swear allegiance to the U.S. and swear that they are not beholden to any foreign power. And this sets up a system for reporting suspicious activity. So 3 million federal employees are going to be investigated through the Federal Employee Loyalty Program, and 378 are fired. And they're not fired because they are communist, but there is reasonable doubt. So they're fired because they can't prove they're not communist. And you have 5,000 additional employees who will resign over the intensity of the investigations that were happening. So out of all of this, and they investigated 3 million federal employees. Out of those 3 million, how many Russian spies were uncovered? How many would you guess? 5, 10, 200, 5,000? I mean, you've got 3 million people investigated. 0. None. It was not an effective use of time or resources. Also in 1947, you have the Taft-Hartley Act. It was an attempt to undermine the gains of labor unions, and it's very much tied into the Cold War as well. They banned sympathy strikes. They banned secondary boycotts. Federal employees couldn't go on strike. Independent states could outlaw closed shops, which is the right, which makes it and they could have right to work states, which don't allow for unions. The president can suspend strikes, and it regulated all union officials. It said that all union officials must take the anti-communist oath, and they must take it to be recognized by the Federal Labor Board. Eventually, the act is ruled unconstitutional, but not till 1965, so it's in place for a very long time. It's in place for many, many years. And in 1948, the CIO, the union we talked about in one of our previous lectures, kicked out all known communists and expelled 12 unions from the Federal Labor Board for being led by members of the Communist Party. And they feared that any affiliation with communists would be detrimental to the CIO. So the CIO completely cleans house of anyone and anything that is at all connected in any way to the Communist Party. For the labor movement, the 50s became a period of retreat. The CIO and the AFL will reunite and reemerge. There is no longer much of a difference. The AFL has liberalized its policies, and the CIO became less militant, so they just decided to go back at it again together. This is all brought about by pressures of the Cold War. The Cold War is going to affect every single aspect of society for a very long time, from the onset of the Cold War right after World War II until the 1990s. So, I mean, the Cold War lasts almost 40 years. It lasts for a very, very long time. And it affects every single aspect of American life. It affects pop culture. It affects economics. It affects every single part of life in America, even its labor unions. In 1950, you have the Internal Security Act. Any member of a subversive organization is required to register with the government. And so you might ask me, what is a subversive organization? Well, a subversive organization is whatever the Attorney General of the United States decides it is. So it's pretty flexible. It includes a few right-wing groups as well, like the KKK and some Nazis, but mostly this group is aimed at left-wing politics. And it is used to exclude any of those people from military and or federal jobs. Also, because the federal government established a system, and because of this, the federal government established a system of emergency detention. What they did is the United States began to construct camps to hold subversives in just in case of an emergency. So the United States began building basically like these little containment camps, and they did so saying that they wanted to be prepared and have somewhere to put subversives if the Soviet Union suddenly attacked, or if the United States became invaded, or if it was engaged in any sort of attack. They weren't ever used, but they were built. Truman vetoed this, by the way, but Congress overruled it. As of 1955, the Attorney General had a very, very long list of subversive organizations. And I mean, it was very long. And I'm not going to name them all because there's hundreds. You can Google it up. You can Google it, though. You can look up, if you're interested, you can look up subversive organizations in the 1950s, and you can find some very interesting stuff. You have the Abraham Lincoln Brigade of the Spanish Civil War. They're on the list. Any sort of organization with any sort of radical element and influence is going to find itself on this list. And in the midst of all of this, you have something happen called the Lavender Scare. So we're going to take a little bit of a pause. You're going to go watch this video, and then we will resume as soon as the video is over. So now you've watched that short video about the Lavender Scare, and I know it's just a trailer, but it gives you some sort of idea of what's happening. The trailer does a really good job. You should actually watch the entire documentary. It's fascinating. But as you saw from that clip, the Lavender Scare is a purge of all gay and lesbian employees from the government. And the reasoning behind this was they were saying that the Soviet Union could blackmail the LGBT community into spying for them or working for them by threatening to expose them. And it said that it left them very open for blackmail, and that automatically made them a security risk. And it's ironic because at the same time, the Communist Party is now expelling gay and lesbian members for the exact same reason. Stalin makes homosexuality illegal again in the USSR and does so under the excuse that it is a decadent lifestyle. Lenin had legalized all of that after the Bolshevik Revolution, but Stalin will come in and make it illegal again. All of this is so important because people argue all the time about this in the United States today, and I find it absolutely fascinating. So I hope that you do as well. All of this is also tied to the retrenchment of American Christianity and Americans recasting themselves as a Christian nation, because communism, especially the USSR communism, the USSR banned religion because they said that religion creates a hierarchy of class. And of course, in a communist system, there's no class. And so they ruled that religion is illegal because of the way that it creates a hierarchy. And so they set themselves up as an atheist nation. So the United States is going to immediately begin trying to work on becoming the exact opposite and setting themselves up as a uber Christian nation. So a lot of the things that people in the United States today focus on and talk about as being core elements of the United States Christian nation are things that weren't done until the 1950s. For example, it wasn't until 1954 that Under God was added to the pledge. It was never there before. And it wasn't until 1956 that In God We Trust was adopted as the U.S. motto on money. It's there now, but it wasn't before. Previously, it had been the Latin quote for out of many. Um, and so that's where this reconnection to Christianity comes from. There also becomes a much more inclusive hunt for the threat of communism that will reach much farther than the federal government. You have Hollywood that is going to be very affected. Conservatives and a lot of these different things like McCarthyism and they go after Hollywood a lot because Hollywood is generally somewhat more liberal. And so in 1947, the HUAC, the House Un-American uh, Committee, Un-American Activities Committee, investigates communism in film and radio. And you have the Hollywood 10. The Hollywood 10 were a group of Hollywood actors, screenwriters, directors who refused to testify. All were held in contempt and sentenced to a year in jail. And they did so not because they were communists, but because they refused to support a witch hunt. And there is a growing Hollywood blacklist. And if you are on it, no movie, no music, no publisher, none of them would touch you. And hundreds end up on the list. Some of them are Langston Hughes. You guys should know who Langston Hughes is. He's one of the most famous African American poets. He's put on the list. Lena Horne, Arthur Miller, he wrote Death of a Salesman, Dorothy Parker, Pete Seeger, Dalton Trumbo, Orson Welles, who's one of the most famous movie people of the era. All of them and many, 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 many more were blacklisted. The FBI also suspected that the It's a Wonderful Life director and that movie specifically was communist propaganda. So they looked for files and informants in Hollywood, and they couldn't ever really do anything with Frank Capra, who is the man who made It's a Wonderful Life. But they very much tried to say that it was a communist because of the way he portrayed the banker. If you haven't seen It's a Wonderful Life, oh my good gosh, do yourself a favor and watch it. It's the best Christmas movie that ever has been or ever will be, besides possibly Elf. But it's very touching, it's very heartwarming, it's very famous, but it does portray a local banker in a very bad light. And so the United States HUAC did try to say that it was a communist propaganda film. In 1949, you have the Smith Act trials. Remember, we talked about the Smith Act a couple of minutes ago. Now you're going to have those people actually go to trial. So between 1949 and 1958, the Communist Party of the U.S. have 11 leaders convicted who will serve 3 to 5 years. Between 51 and 58, you have this whole stream of second-tier leaders that are going to be tried. And so from 1949 until about 57, you'll have people imprisoned under the Smith Act. They will be sentenced and they will be serving jail time. In 1957, their sentences began to get overturned by the Supreme Court because the Smith Act was deemed to be unconstitutional. But for roughly 7 to 8 years, different people were being convicted and sent to jail for it. And then you have the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952. It specifically excluded communist or communist sympathizers from being able to enter or become U.S. citizens. It authorized it allowed the immigration. It allowed for them to discriminate against anyone who was a communist or a communist sympathizer, again, from entering the United States. And so you must swear that you are not a communist or a communist sympathizer before you can enter the United States. In addition, the McCarran-Walter Act also expanded exclusion of homosexuals, anyone with mental defects, and it also ended Asian exclusion. So those are the things that happened under that. And this was so the USSR and China couldn't say that it was racist, um, and that they only created quotas because they had such small quotas. And so they end Asian exclusion, but they do give them very small quotas. They give them extremely small quotas. Not very many people from Asia are allowed to enter the United States every year, but because they don't exclude them completely, the United States gets to say they aren't biased. And that's something that's really important because the USSR will continually accuse the United States of being the far inferior system of government because of Jim Crow that existed in the United States and because of all the racist policies that existed in the United States during this time period. And in that way, Russia was not necessarily wrong. There was, we know about the Jim Crow system and the segregation that's in place. And we'll talk more about Russia's view and accusations of the United States racism in later lectures when we're talking about civil rights and when we're talking about some of those issues specifically. The most famous victim of the Second Red Scare in the Hollywood blacklist is Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was such a phenomenal actor and such a cornerstone of pop culture during this time period. And he had lived in the United States for a very, very long time. You guys should have watched The Dictator speech that he gave, and you've seen how moving he can be. We also watched scenes from his silent films in class, so you know that he was an important figure during this time period. And he had immigrated from England in 1912. So in the 1930s, during the 1930s, he was involved in one of those popular front movements that we talked about last time. It was an anti-fascist, anti-racist movement that he was contributing to. He was never actually part of the Communist Party, but because the anti-fascist group that he was involved with had other connections to the Communist Party, that was enough for the United States to say that he participated in a communist movement. And so in 1952, he went to a London premiere of a movie, and when he tried to return to the United States, he wasn't allowed to. He was never allowed to move back to his home in the United States, and he was only allowed a brief visit in 1972. And all of that was done because he had loose connections to the Communist Party, but they were not, like I said, he worked with an anti-fascist group that happened to have, some people in the group had connections to the Communist Party, but he himself actually did not. And so all of this brings us to the man in the title of the lecture, and that's Joseph McCarthy. He was a senator. In 1950, he was a pretty unknown politician, and until he runs for re-election in Congress. And he needed an issue. He needed an issue to push his popularity, to bring his name to the forefront, to give him some sort of name recognition so that he could guarantee that he could keep his seat in Congress. And so he seizes upon the anti-communist movement, and he makes national headlines by claiming that he has a known list of communists, like a whole list of these like known communists that the United States is absolutely sure are communist. And so, and he says that this list of communists, that they're all employees for the federal government. And so this makes national sensationalist headlines. People are freaking out throughout the United States. And just as a spoiler alert, he didn't have a list. It didn't exist. He kept like shifting the number of names that he claimed to have, and he kept like toying with the public to keep their interest. And the list of people that he did have was the list of people who were fired from the employee loyalty program that was put into place. The like 378 people I mentioned that were fired but never proven to be communists. That's at the end of the day the list of people that he had. But he is reelected, and he launches a series of congressional investigations, and it makes him a national figure. And so in 1954, he bites off more than he can chew by claiming the U.S. military has knowingly ignored communists and that the U.S. Army has been infiltrated by a communist element. Um, and so he actually takes the U.S. Army to court, and it doesn't go well. It doesn't go well at all for McCarthy because the hearings are televised, and he comes off as a bully. He comes off as a jerk, particularly in an exchange with the attorney that's representing the U.S. military. He accuses a military lawyer of knowingly employing communists in his law firm. Now, I'm going to show you a brief little, or I'm not going to show you because I can't show you, but I'm going to pause this here. There should be a YouTube link or whatever on the next slide, and I want you to watch that, and then we'll talk just. So you saw what a jerk McCarthy absolutely came off as. And so those trials absolutely ruined McCarthy. His career was over. He was exposed as a bully with no evidence. He wasn't presenting proof. Everything he was going after were these very weak connections. And as you saw, they straight up told him, have you no decency? And it didn't seem that he really did. And so McCarthy ended up drinking himself to death. But anti-communism didn't disappear with the disappearance of McCarthy. It still remained very strong. And this idea of Soviet spies kept growing. But it's very important to look at the fact and fiction of this. It's mostly fiction. There were very few actual spies in the United States for Russia. But there were many informants. And an informant is quite different than a spy. But they were willing to provide information that they had in exchange for payoffs. So there is some espionage that is happening, and it's mostly done by very regular people. And it's particularly the information that they're trading is information about the U.S. nuclear program. You have Alger Hiss, who had been a communist, and he may have passed information, but historians still argue about this because it was never proven that he was guilty of it. He was even in his trial, he could not be found guilty of espionage. He was only found guilty of perjury because he lied about something. You also have a man named Klaus Fuchs, who was a physicist who developed the hydrogen bomb. He passed info to the USSR and was discovered by the British. And then you have Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. There's a whole lot of information about Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And, I greatly encourage you to research them a little bit because it's absolutely fascinating. Julius worked on the Manhattan Project, but both were accused of espionage. And historians debate this today quite heavily. The things that are known is that they were both communists, and Julius may or may not have engaged in espionage. Evidence seems to suggest that he might have been guilty, but Ethel absolutely did not. The only reason Ethel was arrested and charged was because they thought by arresting and charging Ethel that it would force Julius to come clean in order to save her, but he does not. And so at that point, they refused to back down. So in 1953, both are convicted and both are executed despite her absolute innocence. And this occurred during World War II while they were an ally. So the actual accused passing of the information happened during World War II, even though the trial and the execution won't be until the early 1950s. There was this whole belief, though, that communists and spies were just making monkeys out of Americans. There's a wonderful documentary called The Atomic Cafe. You can watch it for free, and it's one of the two choices that you have for your last writing assignment, the documentary review. So Google the Atomic Cafe, read a little bit about it, and see if that's something that you want to do for your documentary review. But there is, it was, the thing is that despite the fact that the United States government was terrified of communism, it wasn't a very big actual threat. The USSR had zero intention of overthrowing the United States. They were only trying to create buffers. They only wanted to be left alone in their part of the world to engage in their form of government without any interference. They had no desire to come into the United States and overthrow the United States government. That wasn't something that they were interested in or contemplated doing in any way, shape, or form. Uh, and what's really interesting about all of this is in 1944, during the war, the Communist Party of the United States had 44,000 people. That is a lot. But this destroyed the Communist Party. In 1948, they only have 6,000. In 1958, they only have 3,000. And 1,500 of those 3,000 were informants for the FBI who were only plants to try to get information. So that's pretty interesting. The real threat of the whole entire thing is in the arms race and the threat of nuclear war. That's what's terrifying. The United States should not really have worried about a communist invasion. That wasn't something that was going to happen. The threat of nuclear war was constantly hanging over these people's heads, and they engaged themselves in activities like duck and cover. And so this is the last time that I'm going to, this is the last video, this is the last part of the lecture. So when I'm done speaking, I want you to go watch this duck and cover video. My son, Freedom, the 12-year-old, had a field day with this video. It's one of the favorite videos that I show. They actually aired this in school for a very long time. And even when I was a child, I know I was not a child in the 50s and 60s. I'm not that old. But even when I was a child in the 80s, I didn't watch the exact same video, but they still trained us in these duck and cover exercises because it was still the Cold War in the early 80s. And so watch Bert the Turtle, that's his name, and watch how they tell you to handle a nuclear explosion. I think you will get a lot of entertainment out of it. And other than that, I will see you guys in a couple of days because I've got to get through all these videos. So you should see 2 more loaded this week. Make sure you're watching them. Make sure you're paying attention. Try to take some notes if you can. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to contact me. You guys have a great day.